From the outside, it looked like just another run-down gym on a forgotten street corner. But to those who knew him, this was where everything shifted. He was only 8 or 9, a quiet kid from a home where arguments could be louder than the TV, where the fridge sometimes hummed but stayed empty, and where the air always felt tense. That first day, the gym's light bulbs buzzed faintly overhead, casting a yellow haze over the dust in the air. The sound of gloves hitting heavy bags echoed in steady rhythms. Thump, thump, cut through by the short, sharp breaths of fighters locked in their own battles. His gloves were too big, the wraps frayed, and his borrowed headgear slipped every time he moved. The first punch he took wasn't clean, it glanced off, but it rattled him enough to make his vision blink white. For a split second, anyone else might have stepped back. He didn't. Somewhere in that sting, in that blur, there was a strange pull, half pain, half fascination. The coach didn't rush in, didn't console. From the corner of the room, he watched with a calm, almost cold patience, lifting one hand slightly, signaling only one thing: go again. That simple gesture became an unspoken contract. On the cracked walls, posters of Mike Tyson, Roberto Duran, and Sugar Ray Leonard hung like fading gods. The boy's eyes lingered on them, tracing their stances, their expressions. Somewhere deep down, a thought took root. One day, my face will be up there too. It didn't matter that the floor sagged or that the ropes were loose. In his mind, this was already Madison Square Garden. And without realizing it, he had just stepped into the first round of a fight that would last years. From the outside, he looked like any other teenager, tall, restless, carrying the kind of energy that could spill into trouble if left unchecked. But those who knew him saw the difference. On Friday nights, when friends called to meet at the arcade or hang out at the basketball court, he would quietly decline. His place wasn't under neon lights or in crowded malls. It was under the flicker of a gym bulb, the floor slick with sweat, the air thick with the scent of leather and chalk. Some nights were harsher than others. There were 5-kilometer runs in freezing rain, shoes heavy with water, his breath visible in the pale light of the street lamps. Once or twice halfway through, he thought about turning back. But then he'd picture his coach waiting at the end, hands in pockets, eyes sharp and unreadable, and he'd push forward. Their relationship was complicated. At times, the coach felt like a father figure, offering advice that stretched far beyond the ring. Other times, they spoke only in short commands. Again. Faster. Keep your hands up. There was a moment after a minor injury and a string of losses when the boy nearly walked away. But a single sentence from his coach, "You've come too far to turn around now," pulled him right back onto the canvas. With each passing week, the change was visible. His jab cracked sharper, quicker. His footwork flowed like water over stone. The sound of his punches hitting the bag carried a weight that made people glance over. It wasn't just improvement, it was transformation. And in that transformation, something deeper took hold. He no longer trained just to get better. He trained because, for the first time, he could see the outlines of who he might become. The crowd wasn't large, just a few hundred people pressed into a small city gym with flickering yellow lights. But to him, it might as well have been the roar of Madison Square Garden. The ropes sagged, the wooden floor groaned under the ring posts, and the smell of sweat clung to the air like smoke. Round 1 opened with a flurry of jabs, sharp and fast, designed to keep his opponent at range. By the second, that space vanished. The other fighter closed in, pounding the body, forcing him to trade in tight. In the final round, both were running on fumes, feet dragging, lungs burning. Then it came. The left hook. Crisp, sudden, snapping the crowd out of its seat. The bell rang seconds later. He'd won by a hair, but the eruption in the stands made it feel like a landslide. That night, for the first time, his name crackled through a beaten-up microphone, echoing around the rafters. A few days later, a local newspaper printed his photo, sweat-soaked, gloves still on, but smiling like he'd just stolen the sun. Reading those words in black and white, he realized something had changed. He wasn't just a boy in a gym anymore. He was a fighter. Training and fighting had never felt more different than they did now. In sparring, mistakes brought nothing worse than a coach's scowl. Under the lights, a single lapse could cost you blood and the win. People started comparing him, sometimes in jest, sometimes not, to names that carried weight. Canelo, Gervonta, Ryan Garcia. Every comparison was a spark, but also a weight on his shoulders. Back home, family and neighbors spoke of him with a mix of pride and expectation, calling him a chance to put the town on the map. Victories like this made the path ahead feel tangible, as if the professional stage was no longer a dream, but an approaching reality. He didn't know it yet, but this was the point where ambition stopped being a wish and started becoming a debt he'd spend years trying to repay. He signed his first professional contract in a cramped office above the gym, the paper thin, the pen trembling just slightly in his hand. On the page, it was just ink and clauses. In his mind, it was the line between boyhood and the unforgiving world of professional fighting. The pride was there, but so was a pulse of quiet fear, the kind you don't admit out loud. The backstage rituals were a different kind of war. The weigh-in came first. Under the cold glare of fluorescent lights, his body looked sharper but smaller, carved down from days of eating just enough to stand. Then the medical checks, quick hands prodding, instruments beeping, a doctor's nod that sent him to the locker room. Inside, the sound of tape ripping through the air, the sting of liniment oil, the heavy quiet between fighters waiting for their names to be called. The weight cut had been brutal. For 3 days, water was a ration, not a drink. He ran wrapped in trash bags and hoodies until his sweat pooled inside his shoes. The room tilted if he stood too fast. The world sounded muffled, like his ears were full of cotton. Only when the scale settled on the exact number did he finally let himself breathe. But even the fight itself wasn't always honest. There was the bout where the scorecards made no sense, and another where the matchup was tilted before the first bell. In those moments, it felt less like fighting an opponent and more like fighting the structure itself, one punch against 1,000 unseen hands. And then there was the money. Back in his amateur days, he imagined pros taking home paychecks big enough to change their lives. Reality was different. After the trainer's cut, the manager's fee, the gym rent, travel costs, and the never-ending little expenses, what was left was barely more than a working man's wage. The dream had been glossy on paper. In person, it came with cracks, pressure, politics, and the cold arithmetic of survival. Still, he stepped forward, because by now, the ring wasn't just part of his life, it was the only life he knew. It didn't happen all at once. Sometimes a career ends in a single moment, and sometimes it starts slipping quietly, long before anyone says it out loud. For him, the beginning of the end came with one clean right hook from a heavier opponent. His left shoulder burned like it had been ripped apart. He called it a strain. The doctor called it manageable. But every heavy punch afterward lit the same fire in the joint, a pain that became part of his daily vocabulary. Training no longer felt like sharpening steel. It felt like patching up an old, battered ship. A hard sparring session now demanded a week of slow recovery. Muscles ached longer, bruises lingered like stains. Movements he once repeated effortlessly now came with a subtle hesitation, the kind you can't fake away. He noticed the gap most when he looked at the rising stars. They were fast in a way he no longer was, their lungs endless, their energy feeding off the cameras, the interviews, the constant hum of social media hype. He had none of that. Only experience and grit, which felt heavier to carry every year. The coach saw it too. Gone were the short nods of approval. In their place came longer silences and more frequent, "Let's call it early today." He never said the words, but the pause in his gaze was enough. The crowds thinned. Where once the air buzzed with cheers and the scrape of chairs against concrete, now the empty seats were louder than the voices that remained. Under the lights, the ring felt colder, bigger, and the noise from the stands barely reached his corner. Some fighters quit when they see it coming. Others fight harder to push it back. He wasn't sure which one he was yet. But the truth was, the slide had already started. By the time the fight was announced, he already knew his role. He wasn't the headline. He wasn't the story. He was the test. The veteran put in front of a young, undefeated prospect to see if the kid could handle real pressure. At the weigh-in, the difference was as clear as the space between them. The prospect's entourage laughed loudly, swapping jokes like they were already celebrating. Cameras swarmed their side of the room, microphones pushing in for sound bites. Across the floor, he sat quietly in the corner, wrapping his hands, the tape pulling tight with every turn. No one asked him a question. No one even made eye contact. When the bell rang, experience carried him through the first round. His jab found its mark. His footwork cut angles the younger man didn't expect. In the second and third, the kid's pace picked up, pressing forward with the arrogance of youth and the lungs to match. He absorbed it, countered well, even landed a clean left hook that snapped the crowd to its feet. By the final bell, he believed he'd done enough. Maybe not a decisive win, but enough to keep it even. Then came the scorecards. Majority decision, the other guy's hand raised. He felt the heat rise in his chest, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet certainty that the outcome had been written before the fight began. The damage followed him home. A rib bruised from a late body shot, aching every time he laughed or coughed. The paycheck barely covered gym fees and groceries, with just enough left over for gas and a tube of muscle cream. The financial pressure didn't ease, the loss only made it heavier. Some fighters take these fights as stepping stones. For him, they were reminders, a quiet, grinding truth that in boxing you could give your all and still walk away with nothing but pain and an empty seat at the table. It didn't announce itself with a crash. It crept in quietly, showing up in the smallest cracks of his daily life. One morning, he spent nearly 10 minutes pacing the living room before realizing his car keys were still on the kitchen table. Another day, he simply didn't show up for a scheduled training session, not because he didn't care, but because he'd forgotten it entirely. The physical signs were harder to hide now. His vision blurred without warning, hands trembled just enough to make pouring a glass of water awkward. On the stairs, there were moments where his balance shifted and the world tilted under his feet. Even buttoning a shirt or tying his laces sometimes felt like a task that required patience he didn't have. His family saw it. His mother's eyes narrowed when he winced from a sudden stabbing pain in his neck. His older brother asked, quietly but firmly, "Maybe it's time for a checkup?" He brushed it off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The doctor didn't mince words. "Your body is carrying too much damage. If you keep going like this, it won't recover." The warning echoed long after he left the clinic, but out in the parking lot, he convinced himself it didn't apply. Not yet. In quieter moments, he thought of the greats who'd paid the price, champions who once lit up arenas, now speaking slowly, walking carefully, their eyes somewhere far away in a past they could no longer fully touch. And he wondered if he was already on that same road, one step at a time, unable or unwilling to turn back. By now, every sign told him to walk away. His body ached in ways that didn't fade. His memory faltered at the edges, but there was one last reason he couldn't quit, a reason he never spoke aloud. Maybe it was a promise to a father who'd never see him fight again. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the simple, stubborn need to leave the sport on his own terms. With one more win worth remembering, the moment his boots touched the canvas, adrenaline drowned out the pain. The bright glare of the overhead lights, the sound of the crowd spilling over itself, the shrill ring of the opening bell. It was a high no pill could match, no quiet life could replace. Small moments kept him tethered, the snap of a perfect knockout that froze the arena in collective breath, a shy kid slipping a glove across the ropes for an autograph, eyes wide as if meeting a hero. Moments like that whispered to him that he still mattered, but beneath it all was fear. Not fear of losing, not even of getting hurt. Fear of the emptiness waiting beyond boxing. A life with no cheers, no spotlight, no purpose carved into every sunrise. That kind of silence felt heavier than any punch he'd ever taken. And so the loop continued. Train, fight, get hurt. Heal just enough to do it all over again. The days blended into each other, a rhythm he couldn't break. In his mind, the ring wasn't just where he belonged. It was the only place he still existed. Late in the afternoon, he sat in the far corner of the gym, wrapping his hands slowly, watching the next generation take the ring. One skinny kid with bright eyes threw awkward jabs at the heavy bag. Off balance, sloppy, but burning with that raw determination only the young carry. For a moment, it was like looking into a mirror tilted 20 years into the past. He thought about crossing the floor, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder and saying, "Think carefully. Don't walk this road unless you know what it costs." But he didn't. He knew how that conversation would go, how it would have gone with him all those years ago. Passion, when it's pure, is deaf to warnings. So he stayed where he was, winding the cloth around his knuckles, the sound of the tape stretching in the quiet gym. In his mind, a question formed, not just for the kid in front of him, but for anyone chasing a dream. If you knew the price, would you still pay it? The last light of the day spilled through the high windows, throwing his shadow long across the worn wooden floor. The rhythmic whip of the hand wrap echoed, steady and deliberate, like a clock counting down to something unseen. It felt like an ending, but not a final one, because deep down he knew that if the bell rang one more time, his feet would carry him back into the ring without hesitation.